Today I just want to take a quick look at the 1921 silent film, The Phantom Carriage. So this film is also known by a few alternate titles. It was also known as The Phantom Chariot, Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness, and The Stroke of Midnight. And honestly, I think if they had stuck with the title of the novel, Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness, I think that's very intriguing, even though it is kind of, I guess you could say, a long title for a film. But then you've got all of the giallos from the 70s, which had those really cool long titles, but you can't really compare 1920s to the 1970s, I suppose. And for me, this definitely was a very intriguing film. The whole premise here is the thought that the person who dies on New Year's Eve is destined to become death the following year. So obviously just driving this phantom carriage and collecting all of these souls. So essentially, I guess you could say it's a punishment for having lived a bad life. Whoever happens to die on this very auspicious day gets the duty of cleaning up after the world's lost souls, I guess you could say. But what I found also interesting here is, I guess you could say, part of the torment, or maybe just how tiring the work tends to be. It's described as one night in the afterlife is equivalent to 100 living days. So that definitely is a hefty amount of work for one night. But I found it just a very interesting idea because it's something I have never heard presented before, which definitely I thought very cool. So obviously this film was considered, I guess you could say, a very essential piece of cinema. It was also very influential for director Ingmar Bergman, who also later featured a death character in one of his films. So in the Ingmar Bergman film, death was referred to as being a strict master, which was a direct reference to the Phantom Carriage, which, you know, it's definitely great to pay respect or honor to those who came before you, especially if you're acknowledging where your inspirations come from, because from prior work, it's very much my belief that even greater potential pieces of work or inspiration can spring from that. And I know that was very badly worded, I apologize, but definitely a very interesting film. The story of The Phantom Carriage was adapted from a novel entitled Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness, published in 1912. So this film itself, I guess you could say, is definitely was very influential for its time, because it was actually remade twice. So the first time the film was remade, it was under the title The Phantom Wagon. The second time it was released was also once again under the title The Phantom Carriage. So I definitely would like to take a look at the two remakes at a later time. I just want to focus on the original for today. But also just the fact that the film's special effects at that time were considered groundbreaking, in the sense that they did use double exposure for the camera. At that point in time, there wasn't any sort of optical printing, which potentially would have made the work easier. That obviously didn't come around until the 1930s. This film was released in 1921. So the fact that they really did have to put extra effort into these ghost effects, which did allow the characters playing the ghost to appear transparent as well as interact with their actual surrounding, that work definitely did take an extensive amount of time. So the film is also just known for the fact that it spent so much time in post-production just, finalizing the product, but definitely very well worth it. And then obviously, like I said, very groundbreaking for its time, but also the manner in which the story is told was also advanced for its time, because the film features flashbacks, but you've also got flashbacks within flashbacks. So it's a more complex form of storytelling. Obviously older films did have more of a simplistic plot line, but I guess you could say this is also kind of the beginning of whenever subplots started occurring within film and story. So that also, in a sense, was, I guess you could say, very revolutionary in the sense of storytelling. So on 2 counts, this film was actually ahead of its time. The shooting or the filming of this movie was actually shorter than the actual post-production. They completed this within 2 months, but once again, part of what slowed them down a bit is for that double exposure, they had to film the same scene twice, and this was with a hand crank camera. So the person working the camera actually had to be careful to actually crank the camera at the same pace that they did originally so that things would line up and match up perfectly. So while watching this film, it definitely does pull in the viewer, or at least it did manage to engage me very early in the film. You have a Salvation Army nun who is basically on her deathbed, and she is asking for this one man to come see her on her deathbed because she basically wished him well, and she wants to know if he made good on his promise, I guess you could say, even though he made it sarcastically without any actual feeling or emotion. But basically how they met was he was a drunkard, I guess you could say a bit of a tramp or a homeless guy who came to stay there. He was the first guest at the hostel, I guess you could say, and this particular nun took the time to mend his coat. She did offer him a meal before he went to bed. Obviously, he was just very grumpy and just wanted to go to bed. So the following morning, he finds that his coat has been tailored. He wants to know who fixed this. When the nun presents herself, he basically just rips up the coat and says, "I prefer it this way," you know. Very smug, very jerk thing to do, but in his mind, he has earned the right to just be rude and nasty because apparently, as we discover through a flashback, his wife has left him because she's basically just tired of his nonsense. And he actually has quite a detailed story, so I'm not going to tell you about every single one of his flashbacks, but you know, he's definitely a very awful person. The character who is playing Death is a friend who he had known that passed away the prior year. So this man is basically turning over the reins of the death chariot to this guy. Obviously, he does not want the job, but a lot of what goes on in this film is very interesting to me because this death person, the one who will retire, is basically just going through this man's life events, kind of like, you're an awful person because such and such. And he doesn't give us examples. The film shows this to us via flashback, but at some point in time, I kind of got the idea that maybe to some degree this film was potentially the basis for It's a Wonderful Life, because it does kind of show, well, in the other film, obviously, it shows kind of like an alternate reality of what could have been, but I don't know. For some reason, there seems to be, in my mind, a correlation. I did not find any documentation saying whether or not it actually was, but to me, it very much felt that way. So, obviously, throughout the course of this drunkard's life, this nun character does wish him well. She even presents an opportunity, I guess you could say, for him to redeem himself, which he pretty much just stoles all over. But that is very much this character's nature. He's very, I guess you could say, self-justifying that things should be this way because such and such. And in his mind, he is correct rather than acknowledging his faults, learning, and bettering himself as a person, which never happens, unfortunately. There was one particular scene in this film which reminded me of The Shining, and obviously that very much does make sense because this film was also an influence for director Stanley Kubrick. So the one scene in which Jack Nicholson is busting down the door with an axe, pops his head through the door, yells, "Here's Johnny," that was basically, I guess you could say, in reference or homage to the Phantom Carriage, which, ironically, the scene in the Phantom Carriage in which the drunkard is also busting down a door to get at his wife and children was also an homage to a different film. So this is actually in reference to a film titled Broken Blossom. So if you actually want to trace the history of the hatchet door, you pretty much have to start there, which, from a cinematic interest, I definitely would love to visit that other film as well, just to kind of get more of a side-by-side comparison of these breaking doors. I don't know, maybe I'll make a media discussion on that later. But yeah, I mean, I definitely saw that reference when I was watching the movie. I was watching this and very much thinking, this feels like The Shining, and duh, because Stanley Kubrick was making reference to this film, which I never knew, but definitely very cool. So you've definitely got a very detailed plot. Potentially it can become maybe a little bit tiresome at times, but it definitely does hold the interest, especially the fact that you're following the life events of this wretch, seeing how he got from point A to point B. You see basically how he developed as a person within this storyline. Obviously, every single event in his life built upon itself and molded him into the person that he allowed himself to become. The fact that he was offered several opportunities within the film to redeem himself, not just the nun herself, but even just someone at a prison who was trying to set him straight, and he just kept fouling things up. But that's very true to life, and I think that's definitely a good message to take to heart, especially if you do decide to watch this film on New Year's Eve, which is the day that this film takes place on. Just taking that into consideration, that you can change and better yourself. You don't have to be stubborn and continue to plow down this same path. To me, that's the basic moral of this film, and definitely something that it doesn't hurt anyone to keep in mind or revisit, because we all do have those moments where we just hit patches of bad luck and we kind of can become a bit of a curmudgeon, but it's up to you whether or not you want to rise above it, how you want to proceed and handle that situation. So I think it's definitely a very good message to take to heart as you enter a new year. But that is pretty much all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.